Okay, can you see my screen?
Yep,
All right,
Helen.
sounds good. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our fall chaos meeting. We are so excited to have you here with us today. Before we get started for our speakers today, I wanted to take a moment to introduce what chaos is for anyone who's not familiar with this group or is joining us for the first time. So chaos is the Coastal Hazards of Superior community of practice. As a community of practice, we're focused on creating a platform for sharing and learning about the coastal hazards that impact our Lake Superior communities, whether that's things like flooding, erosion, coastal storms, and we're going to hear actually about some of those hazards today from our speakers. We meet this goal through regular meetings like today. Regular meetings like today, and also through our regular communications. We have a monthly newsletter that we send out, and we are a steering committee that's helping to organize this, and that's including folks like me from the Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program, which is part of our Department of Natural Resources. We also have Madison Rodman joining us from Minnesota Sea Grant. We're going to hear from several folks from University of Wisconsin Sea Grant, but we also have on our committee, we have the Lake Superior Reserve, Wisconsin's Coastal Management Program, and NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. Our goals are to be a platform for sharing events, resources, and updates. We have meetings like this that are trying to help people be aware of current projects and resources and tools that can help you become more resilient to these hazards. Now, membership in this community practice is free and open to anyone who has an interest. If you are not currently receiving our monthly newsletter, you're not officially listed as a member of this community, so please get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat box, and we'd love for you to join us. Now today, we are very excited to learn more about how to become more resilient as a coastal community. First, we'll hear about two new tools that are developed by our colleagues in Wisconsin that are aimed at helping communities understand their relative risks and steps that they can take to become more resilient. And those are the Coastal Resiliency Self-Assessment and Flood Resilience Scorecard tools. We're going to have a group discussion that we can take some time to actually compare those tools, talk about the differences of when you might want to use one versus the other, and ideally help you be able to figure out if that is a tool that's useful for you and your community. Then we're going to go over to Grand Marais, Minnesota, because we've been focused a lot on Wisconsin first thing. And we're going to do a virtual field trip. This is a first time for us to try this. And afterwards, we have one of the project organizers here. She's going to give a little bit more background about one of those projects, and we'll be able to have some questions and learn more about using some nature-based vegetation buffers to help protect shoreline. So before we start, I do like to always give an update on who's here today. I've seen some people are introducing themselves in the chat box. Please feel free to keep adding that information in. Just tell us who you are, where you're joining us from. We had 90 folks register today, 44 from Minnesota, 35 from Wisconsin, 6 from Michigan, 4 from Illinois, and 1 person from my home state of Ohio. Yes! But before we get started, just please take a moment to introduce yourself in that chat box because we want to hear who's here today. Let me stop sharing. Okay. All right. Okay, it sounded like my audio and video were freezing, so I apologize for that. Our first speaker today is Adam Bechle from Wisconsin Sea Grant. Adam is sharing the Coastal Resiliency Self-Assessment tool with us today. Before Adam presents, I just want to clarify, we're going to hold questions for Adam until after both Adam and our next speaker, Emma, present, and then we're going to take those questions together so we can have a little bit of comparison between those two tools. So Adam, feel free to take it away, and in the meantime, if you have a question, please type that into that chat box. Adam, I can see you, and I see your slides.
All right.
Coming up.
I'm having trouble seeing my own slides, so let's boot this up again. All right. There we go. All right, well, thanks for having me. As Melanie said, I'm Adam Bechle, Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant. Today I'm going to talk about our Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment Tool, which I sort of has a tagline of a starting point for building community resilience to coastal hazards. So first off, when we talk about coastal resilience, it's nice to start with a common definition. And so we derive ours from NOAA, who provides us funding, and their definition is the ability to bounce back from coastal hazards rather than just reacting when an event or conditions happen. And so that means kind of being more informed of the hazards and being prepared to deal with them so that when they do happen, there's an ability to cope and rebound and not suffer as many impacts and be able to get back on our feet again sooner rather than later. And so just wanted to sort of underscore what that means a little bit with these pictures moving from left to right. You know, one thing is just to understand what the potential for hazards are. Seeing here erosion and trees falling in the water, losing land, being able to develop strategies to cope with issues like high water levels, and then finally acting to sort of limit the future effects, putting mechanisms in place to be able to cope and bounce back when we see hazards in the future, and things like not having development be built close to eroding bluffs and not allowing clear cutting of vegetation and things like that, so that we're not setting ourselves up for pain in the future. And so we developed the Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment as part of a NOAA Coastal Resilience Grant, which was a partnership, a team of the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, the University of Wisconsin College of Engineering, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, and Wisconsin Sea Grant. And so again, we put this together to try to address these issues and provide a starting point for communities to think about how they can build their resilience to coastal hazards. So some of the challenges that folks face in this process is sort of asking, how can we address coastal hazards besides just building shoreline armor? That tends to be, for a lot of folks, maybe a first thought is we just need to armor the coast and protect it. But that typically is an expensive proposition, can't do it everywhere, and can have unintended consequences. So what else can be done? What can be done in the future or to keep this from happening again in the future? Certainly, there's a lot of pain being felt with the water levels now and responding to the conditions, but what can we do thinking forward for when water levels go back down and we see extreme lows potentially in the future, and then when we come back up and see extreme highs, how can we handle it in a better way? And what roles can the different departments and agencies and organizations that we're involved with play in this process? And so again, we developed this Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment to provide a framework for communities to start to consider some holistic set of actions to help plan, prepare, and ultimately bounce back from coastal hazards. So how did we make it? Well, we saw a bunch of tools that were out there that had resilience in them, like the Gulf of Mexico had a coastal community self-assessment. Maryland has a very comprehensive Coast Smart Community Scorecard. And there's other things for the Midwest, but we didn't really find anything that focused on the issues that Great Lakes coastal communities feel, like bluff erosion and coastal flooding. These tools provide a framework to go through certain considerations to build resilience. But we also know there's quite a bit of information out there, like living on the coast, fact sheets about coastal slopes and erosion, guidance on policy options that can be implemented. So what we did was we took some of those considerations and put them in the framework of these resilience scorecards to come up with a Great Lakes specific coastal resilience self-assessment. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So if you would like to follow along at home and find this either now or at a later time, if you go to your favorite web search and just type in coastal resilience self-assessment, that should take you to our webpage and our PDF of the self-assessment. So starting off, this tool is intended to be completed by a diverse team in a community, including planning, zoning, public works, engineering, emergency management, parks, really anyone with a stake in the coast or in assets at the coast. It's really best when multiple people are at the table providing a variety of input on these issues. And it can be completed rather quickly, say in under an hour or longer, depending on how much conversation and discussion gets developed by the prompts, basically. So without further ado, let's kind of go in and tour the tool. So there's 3 parts. Part 1 is identifying coastal hazard risks. And so this is a matrix that was adopted from the Regional Planning Commission's tool they use to help guide hazard mitigation planning. And so it looks a little intimidating, but I'll guide you through it. So the first column here is just different types of coastal hazard issues that you would want to discuss. And then across the top are just different criteria for how resilient you feel about your community's ability to deal with that issue. So starting with probability, how likely will it occur? And what you do here is you just sort of qualitatively rate high, moderate, and low for each of these categories. So in this case, coastal recession and bluff failure, a lot of folks probably feel like this is a high probability to happen, and it's happening around the coast. Going into how that might impact things like human life, coastal property, and then any businesses or agencies that might provide services along the coast. And then how prepared you feel, what level of planning is done for this issue. And again, this is not a quantitative assessment. We do give a risk score that's automatically calculated, but it's really a way to start the conversation between different folks and really play out the different pieces that are involved with dealing with coastal hazards. So as you go through and fill it out for the different hazards, this sheet will give out a risk score. And what does this mean? Well, 75 risk score really doesn't mean anything on its own, but it allows you to summarize the conversation and kind of compare through these different criteria, which hazards kind of come out the highest risk. So in this case, shoreline recession and bluff failure gets a 75, that comes out the highest. Next would be beach loss. Again, just a way to summarize this conversation of these different hazards between different folks and sort of come up with a way to talk about it. Then we move into what I call the meat of the self-assessment, and this is the Resilience Practices Questionnaire. It has 40 yes/no questions across a wide variety of ways to address coastal hazards, including understanding the impacts, hazard mitigation planning, community planning like land use or comprehensive planning, local ordinances, public education and engagement on these issues, the role of shore protection in coastal resilience, managing water on coastal lands, for communities with beaches, considerations for that, and ports, harbors, and marinas for those communities that have those. So to give a sense of what these questions are, we'll go through a couple sample questions in the poll. So Madison, if you wouldn't mind doing the first question, this comes from our Understanding Coastal Hazard Impacts section. Are there any estimates of future financial losses that may result from coastal hazards, including losses to private property, public property, infrastructure, and utilities? So those of you out there can answer for your community whether yes, you have this, no, or you're not sure if this exists. So seeing a lot of not sures, about 60% not sure, 20% yes. So if you answered no or not sure to this, it's something to look into. Potentially a way to guide prioritization of actions in a community, and a first step to building resilience. So I think we can close that poll. Looks pretty, yep, 61% not sure. And when we use this tool, we had about 11 of 13 communities say no and 2 not be sure. So this is a big area for opportunity around the Great Lakes, I think. Can you go to poll 2, please, Madison? And this question comes from our local ordinance section. Are there ordinances pertaining to coastal hazards in your community that are consistent in policy and language with surrounding jurisdictions? So go ahead and answer that question. And this is one thing we've heard from folks, particularly on the ground, is just being able to be clear about what's allowable in a community and stemming any confusion from knowing what their neighbor could do or what someone they know could do. People really wanted to know and have sort of consistent language, or at least the lay of the land about what's current and where they compare. So again, this also could be an opportunity for a lot of the folks on the call with 27% no and 50% not sure. And then finally, let's walk to our final poll. This comes from our shore protection section. Is inspection and maintenance of shore protection structures performed routinely? So go ahead and answer that. And this is seeing a lot of, again, similar to the previous questions, a lot of no and not sure. I think we're pretty stable with response, so you can probably end in Madison. So again, this would be an opportunity with the folks around the table to build that into future plans and the cost of doing inspection and maintenance of shore protection, because I'm sure a lot of us have seen things that are not maintained are the first to sort of fail when we have high water and pressures from storms. So finally, once we go through that 40 questions, there's just a summary of where the team can sort of talk about what actions resonated the most with them, what seems like something that can be implemented and have a high value in the community. This will definitely vary from user to user, and just gives an opportunity to say what question seemed to generate the most response and what are some steps we could take forward. There is an appendix to this assessment for each section that links to resources that could be useful in moving forward. For instance, for the local ordinances question, we do have links to model coastal setback ordinance for Wisconsin, for ports, harbors, and marinas, for instance, a port inspection best practices fact sheet. So really trying to provide where you could go to move forward with some of these options. So quickly want to cover how this has been implemented. We had, as I said, our NOAA Coastal Resilience Grant project. We implemented this in 4 counties. We had all 4 counties complete the assessment and 9 communities for a total of 13 respondents. And we did have funding available in this grant to implement some of these actions. So Milwaukee County Parks, one of their questions that resonated with them was our first test question. Do we have estimates of future financial losses? So what they did was an assessment of their coastal land holdings in the park system, look at what assets might be at risk, how close they are to the coast, and then pay the consultant to do an assessment of their shore protection structures, 20 plus miles of coast, to kind of get a priority of what needs the most attention and what might be an estimated cost to fix it up. In this example of their offshore breakwater that has some gaps in it, and that's causing waves to get through, some damage to the marina and shoreline behind it. So they're kind of setting themselves up to figure out, given limited resources, what should we tackle first? The city of Racine answered our second question. Ordinances pertaining to coastal hazards consistent with the surrounding jurisdictions. They developed somewhat of an audit tool for the communities in their county to kind of figure out, where does each city, village, or county have jurisdiction, and where does that stand? How are they current with the model ordinances, and where could improvements be made to limit development, limit the risk to development? And then finally, Port Milwaukee kind of addresses our third question, a little bit different one though, the one targeted at ports and marinas. Does your facility conduct regular assessments of critical infrastructure? And do you have a assessment of cost to maintain and repair its assets? They are acquiring some equipment to do a survey of their port facility using side scanning sonar and underwater drones to be able to identify problems before they become catastrophic, and be able to maintain and fix their infrastructure. And their staff is getting trained on how to use this equipment and how to sort of write up a report to assess what the cost might be to do this maintenance. Again, trying to get ahead of issues that may only present themselves as a failure of their dock wall, for instance. So finally, when it comes to using this assessment, it provides a framework to start the coastal resilience conversation. As you can see, it's not a complete analysis, but it does try to cover a lot of the topics to get folks started. The best results come from collaborative teams that bring in a lot of folks with different responsibilities on the coast to help them understand say where Parks is having issues that Public Works might not be aware of, and maybe there's solutions that can come by with those working together. There is a possibility to have virtual facilitation, discussion, or debriefing available upon request. Definitely depends on the scope of what's needed and availability, but I'm definitely happy to help folks go through this as I can. And then certainly looking for funding to implement these actions. That's always a challenge. At least in Wisconsin, the Coastal Management Program is happy to see folks do this assessment, and it helps to identify practices from this assessment. And then certainly what we heard from our last talk, FEMA building resilient infrastructures and communities can help with some of the infrastructure projects. Again, if you're looking for this tool, web search for Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment. And with that, I'll end.
Thank you so much, Adam. Again, we're going to wait for questions until after our next speaker presents, and then we'll have a group discussion. So our next speaker is Emma Holtan. She is going to share with us a really new resource, the Flood Resilience Scorecard, that's just been released by Wisconsin Sea Grants. So Emma, I see your slides are coming up.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Okay, sweet. Thank you. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Emma, and I am the Flood Resilience Intern with the Wisconsin Department of Health Services Climate and Health Program. And I'm excited to tell you about the Flood Resilience Scorecard, which is a tool the Climate and Health Program has been working to create with Wisconsin Sea Grant and numerous other partners. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about flooding and public health in Wisconsin for background, and then I'll go into what the Flood Resilience Scorecard is, what it's made up of, and how to use it. And then to hopefully give you a better idea of what it could potentially look like in action, I'll talk about our pilot test of the scorecard this past summer with the city of Washburn, and then finally talk about next steps for the tool. In this photo and the rest of the photos of floods in this presentation are from the 2018 flood in southern Wisconsin, and credit to Wisconsin Emergency Management. So flooding and public health, as you all know, in Wisconsin and in the Great Lakes region, we have an abundance of water resources, which provides us with numerous benefits, but also presents us with a great challenge as detrimental flooding is becoming more common as our climate changes. To show how those climatic changes are leading to more flooding, I'm relying on Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, or WICI's report to the Governor's Task Force on Climate Change. The report, which was submitted earlier this year, states that over the past 70 years in Wisconsin, we've seen an overall increase in annual precipitation of 15%, or 4.5 inches, although as you can see, that does vary by region. And then beyond annual precipitation, we're also seeing extreme precipitation events, so events where we're seeing lots of rain in shorter amounts of period becoming more common. And both annual precipitation and these extreme precipitation events are predicted based on modeling to continue to increase in amount and frequency over the next couple, or in the future, excuse me. And we're starting to realize what that means for us, especially over the last decade, which was the wettest on record in Wisconsin. Communities across the state have experienced 100-year or greater precipitation events, many leading to historic rainfalls, which you can see in these white dots. This map's also from WICI, and some of them being extremely detrimental. These pictured again are the 2018 flood, but I'm sure you can recall the 2012, 2016, and 2018 floods which hit the south shore of Lake Superior. And those storms together caused tens of millions of dollars in damage and wiped out roads and culverts and bridges and even Saxon Harbor in the 2016 storm. So as you can see, flooding is presenting us with infrastructural damage, building damage, and also damage to our economy, but that's not all. Flooding also poses a great risk to our public health. Flooding has the potential to impact all aspects of our health, both directly and indirectly. Directly, we see flood-related injury and death, usually associated with storm events themselves, and indirect effects can range from the challenges and shortages which could potentially be presented to health facilities, indirect effects from standing floodwaters, which could be emitting pathogens from the human waste or livestock waste that they might pick up, lead to structural damage and potentially drinking well contamination, and also the traumatic effects that these events can have on community members and ourselves. So the risks of flooding are great, and as these flood events are expected to increase in both frequency and detriment, it's important that across the state we're working to build resilience together, but that can be, like Adam said, sort of an overwhelming process, and it can be tricky to know where to start, which is why the Flood Resilience Scorecard was designed. The DHS and partners designed this tool to be a guide for local public officials to comprehensively assess their community's risk and ability to be resilient in the face of a flood. It uses a whole community approach to identify key areas of vulnerability in your community, and then based on those areas of vulnerability, present recommendations which could help you build resilience. These can range from policy change to partnership development to community engagement to construction, etc. The list goes on. How it works exactly is that local officials assemble a team of suggested staff and experts, and together they move through 3 different modules: the environmental, institutional, and social module, which I'll get into more in a second. But in general, each module presents necessary background information and lists necessary materials, and then goes into 5 different subsections, which cover different themes under the overarching theme of the module. The subsections are made up of multiple choice questions, which look exactly like this. This is a screenshot from the scorecard. And then based on how your community answers these questions, they are presented with a set of recommendations if they're deemed vulnerable in that subsection. So each subsection is paired with a potential set of recommendations. These recommendations provide various different options for things that could be implemented to better improve resilience in your community. So that's sort of how it works. To get into more of what it entails, I'll briefly go through each module. In the environmental module, the environmental module is important to our assessment of resilience because climatic features and also landscape features largely shape the experience of flooding you're likely to have in your community. So, for example, whether or not you're likely to see recurrent flooding. The subsections which make it up are the precipitation pattern section, which look at historic, current, and projected rainfall patterns. Slope and elevation looks at the amount of and intensity of slopes, as well as the abundance of floodplains. Land use and future development looks at pervious versus impervious surfaces, stormwater management, and also green development strategies. Soils assesses the water storage capacity of the soils which underlie your community, and agricultural practices look at what sorts of ag practices are in use and or are being regulated. So the next module is the institutional module, and the institutional module is important to our assessment of resilience because institutions often act almost like the backbone of our resilience building through the influence they have over planning, policy, and coordination. The subsections which make it up are resource inventory and mapping, which looks at flood-related maps and historical information, as well as any other background information necessary for future flood planning. Plan quality and coordination looks at to what extent flooding is addressed in your community plans and who's involved in the planning process. Staff and technological capacity assesses just that. And tools looks at the state of and maintenance for gray infrastructure, so things like roads and culverts and dams, as well as the state of and planning for green infrastructure practices, as well as any sorts of non-structural policy tools you might have in place to regulate floodplain or stormwater management. And then implementation and enforcement looks at how regulation around flooding in your community is enforced and what prompts its implementation. So, for example, things like planning goals or funding sources. And then the last module is the social module. And again, this is important to our assessment of resilience because socioeconomic and cultural sources of vulnerability largely shape the extent of the impact of flood damage and flood event on your community members, as well as your whole community's ability to respond. And when we consider these things, along with the potential health effects of a flood, we're able to build a more holistic and equitable approach to resilience, which is something I hope we're all striving for. The 5 subsections which make it up are the sociodemographic characteristics section, which looks at social vulnerability across multiple scales, focusing on identifying priority populations or those folks in your community who, based on their sociodemographic characteristics, would have the most difficulty preparing for or responding to a flood. Transportation and housing looks at the accessibility and capacity of transportation, as well as the state of housing. Health indicators looks at the capacity of different health services and facilities. And community partnerships looks at the representation for priority populations, as well as what sorts of organizations or partnerships are available to your community members to help them through and post a flood event. And education and outreach assesses how exactly you're getting your community involved in the resilience process. So that's kind of what it's made up of. The hope is for this tool that as you move through it, you're able to develop a baseline for comprehensive readiness and resilience, and also be connected to numerous best management practices, resources, and experts. And while some of these are definitely Wisconsin specific, the general premise of the tool we think could benefit communities outside of Wisconsin as well. So to give you a better idea of what it could look like in action, I'll talk about this past summer with our pilot. We piloted this scorecard with Washburn, Wisconsin, which is a small coastal community on the Chequamegon Bay of Lake Superior. And like many smaller, more rurally located towns in Wisconsin, it has limited flood resources on the municipal level. Initially, we had hoped to do sort of an in-person, like workshop-esque experience with Washburn to sit down with their team and all work through the scorecard together. But due to the COVID pandemic, things were changed, and I, as the intern, ended up sort of filling out the scorecard for Washburn without contacting them and only using resources I could find online. For our team, this simulated an experience of the scorecard for someone without ample background knowledge or resources. We did later present our results to Washburn to gather feedback from them. And so it didn't look exactly like we were expecting it to, but it still provides me with an example to share with you all today. So I'm going to pull an example from each module. The first is a precipitation pattern section from the environmental module. If you and your community were to sit down to do this together, you wouldn't need to bring anything to the table for this section because maps like these are embedded in the subsection of the scorecard. And so technically anyone, no matter their expertise, could fill out this section. In Washburn, as you can see, which is located right here, they've seen a large increase in annual precipitation and are expected to see more intense precipitation events. And so based on these and the ways I answered the rest of the questions, recommendations were suggested. What that looks like for this subsection of the scorecard is modeling for on-site stormwater storage features, so using stormwater flow modeling to identify where in your community things like rain gardens or bioswales or bioretention areas would be of most benefit. And another recommendation is working to enhance and preserve natural infrastructure with water storage capacity. So this could be enforcing things like lower open space development, increasing tree cover, or wetland preservation and restoration. The next example is the resource inventory and mapping section from the institutional module. If you and your community were to sit down and do this, it would be helpful to have a city planner or zoner take the lead on this. And what you need to bring to the table would be any flood-related maps for your community. So these usually are found in community plans or hazard mitigation plans, as well as FEMA's flood insurance rate maps or firms. For Washburn in particular, as you can see, these are their firms and there's a section missing here. And these are last updated in 2011, which is before any of those extreme precipitation events that happened over the past 10 years happened in the South Shore region. And so they're somewhat outdated. And then outside of this, other flood-related maps were limited in my search. And so based on these findings and the way I answered the rest of the questions, recommendations again were suggested. What that looks like for this section of the scorecard is working to update, maintain, and supplement existing flood maps. So making the schedule, identifying funding sources, looking at local data, working through partnerships for new mapping, etc. And then the last example is the health indicator section from the social module. If you and your community were to sit down and do this, it would be helpful to have your local public health officials and or your local emergency planning committee, if that exists, take the lead on this. And you need to bring census data and your local knowledge of health facilities in your area. Other information necessary to complete this subsection is provided within links. And in Washburn, as you can see from the screenshot of the risk assessment flood tool from the DHS, there's limited health facilities, which makes a lot of sense due to their size and location. But based on this and the ways in which I answered the rest of the questions, recommendations were suggested. Again, what that looks like for this section is providing educational materials to public health officials about flooding, and another would be working with them to create emergency plans to have in place in case of a flood. So I hope that that gives you a little bit better idea of what the scorecard could do. As far as next steps goes for us, the scorecard is recently available on the Sea Grant website, which is super exciting. It's available in full PDF format and also by module. So if your community feels that it only needs to assess, say, their institutional vulnerability to flooding, they can choose to do that. Eventually, we'd love to have the scorecard become a more interactive web-based interface, but this is funding dependent. So in the meantime, we're working to develop support resources, including a facilitation guide, which should help local officials guide their team through this process, as well as a funding resources guide, which will identify funding sources that could potentially help implement the recommendations. And if this all seems interesting to you or your community, or you think your community would benefit, please reach out to us. We are looking for interested communities to use the Flood Resilience Scorecard. We rely on feedback to continually adapt this tool to best meet the needs of communities. There's potential to include this in any FEMA hazard mitigation assistance grants you're applying for this upcoming year. So that's a possibility. So if you have questions or you would like support going through this process, please contact Maggie Fallon at the DHS or Natalie Chin at Sea Grant. And this is the link to the scorecard, which I'm sure we can share if it hasn't already been shared. And other than that, just want to thank our partners who helped make the scorecard possible and bring it online. And that's it for me. So thank you. And I think that we have a few poll questions for you to answer that will help us with our work with the scorecard. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Emma. Hi, everyone. This is Natalie Chin with the Wisconsin Sea Grant. So I was part of the FRS team, and then also we'll be facilitating our discussion for the next 15 minutes. So as Emma said, we have a couple poll questions. Thanks, Madison, for launching those for us. And then if you have questions for either of our presenters, please feel free to put those in the chat. Great. And I think we'll give folks a few more seconds to answer this first poll question. It's, to what extent would your community be interested in using the scorecard? And then Maggie, I noticed that you're on the call. I don't know if you wanted to jump in and say anything while folks are answering these poll questions.
No, nothing major to add. I just wanted to thank Emma and Natalie and Adam for all of their hard work. I don't know if Tenny is on, but for all their hard work with the Flood Resiliency Scorecard. I'm glad it's finally online, and I'm happy to get the tool out there for people to use. And hopefully, if you guys do choose to use it, you'll contact us again so we can pick your brains on how we can improve it and make it even more usable. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, it looks like folks are wrapped up with that one, so maybe we can move to the next one. For the second question, we were just interested in which module of the scorecard might interest you the most, or if you're not sure. Great, so it looks about 50% in for environmental, 33% social, less for institutional, and then some folks who aren't sure. So Thanks for that. Great. Okay, and then the last question is just wondering which of the following might help your community use a scorecard. So as Emma mentioned, we're looking at developing facilitation guides. We're also available to help run through a guided process of the tool, working on creating an interactive version of the tool. As Emma mentioned, the recommendations are kind of Wisconsin specific right now. So would a version of the scorecard for your state be helpful? And then if you have other things that you might want to describe in the chat, that would be useful, or if you're not sure. Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so I just wanted to make a note that there were a few comments in the chat. One was from Robin, who mentioned during Adam's presentation that communities may be doing inspection and maintenance of publicly owned infrastructure, but don't always have documentation, which is an issue that they're running into. And then Adam, you answered the next question, which is in the chat, that says, do you know of communities with good examples of coastal regulations? And I won't try to read all that, but Adam, I don't know if you wanted to expand on that at all.
Sure. I posted links to 2 resources that have some examples, either model ordinance or sort of an inventory of Wisconsin communities with coastal setback ordinances. And this is the sort of information that's in the appendix. So for like similar questions like that on the other topics, the appendix of the Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment could be a good place to find it.
Great, thank you. And then we do have links to the scorecard, some additional information about climate and health for Wisconsin. A note from Tony. Thanks, Tony, for your participation in our pilot process too. And then a question from Melanie, and that's is there any interest in making a Minnesota version of the Flood Resilience Scorecard? It's not something we've talked about yet, but if folks on the call see value in that, and I think we did see some interest from the poll, that's something that we could talk about maybe as a community of practice. So we still have about 10 minutes for questions. I'm reminded of a question that Melanie brought up earlier, which is maybe similarities or differences between the tools and maybe when you might want to use one versus the other. Adam, do you want to try and answer that?
Sure.
On the spot.
I mean, so like, I just had to unmute and grab my phone. The Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment, I would say, is less in depth than the Flood Resilience Scorecard. The Flood Resilience Scorecard focuses very, I won't say narrowly, but focuses on a lot of the issues that involve resilience to flooding in detail and targets specific recommendations. Whereas the Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment was kind of written more as a tool for someone like myself as an outreach specialist to be able to guide conversations with communities. So some of the detail that maybe the Flood Resilience Scorecard has ingrained in it would come from someone that's helping go through it, someone with more expertise or going through the appendix. So Coastal Resilience Self-Assessment covers a bit more broad, like erosion and flooding. It can be done quicker. The Flood Resilience Scorecard is more narrow on flooding and has a lot more detail in it. So,
great, thank you. Also, I think maybe to mention about the Flood Resilience Scorecard is it's meant to be a more proactive tool. So if your community has already been significantly impacted by flooding, it might not be the best time to use it. So that's just another thing to maybe consider. It's really meant for helping with planning in advance of flooding and not necessarily recovery. Okay, and then let's see, Melanie put in a question. What is the commitment needed to use these tools for a coastal community? Maybe Emma, if you want to talk a little bit about your process for going through the scorecard.
Yeah, I can talk about that. So the Flood Resilience Scorecard is pretty comprehensive, and it is a little bit of a time commitment of a process. It takes about like 2 to 3 hours to make it through, or it took me 2 to 3 hours to make it through each module. And so you have to commit to it, but it's intended to be very in-depth. And so that is the whole point, to like put time into it, to look through everything. As far as Adam's tool, I'm not really sure, but that's for the Flood Resilience Scorecard. Yeah.
Yeah, so as I kind of alluded to in the presentation, can be done in the coastal resilience self-assessment can be done in, under an hour. As we said, it's a little bit less in depth than the Flood Resilience Scorecard. The folks who've completed that tool have ranged in their commitment from, just one person filled it out and I had a conversation with them, to currently on hiatus working with the city of Bayfield going through it, but they arranged, committee of the different folks from various departments as part of a little bit larger project. But then we did some facilitated going through part 1 of the tool. We were going to go through part 2 of the tool this summer, but that's been put on hold due to the pandemic.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and something that with the Flood Resilience Scorecard, I can at least mention that we've based on our pilot process and conversations with the community, we're trying to figure out a way to break it up so that maybe smaller chunks are possible, using the facilitation guide, et cetera, to make it a little easier to go through as well. So that is something that we're thinking about. And I think also as we move towards generating an interactive version of the tool, maybe that will help some of that too. Okay, well, we still have 5 minutes for questions, but I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So we're ahead of schedule, but Melanie, maybe that's okay. And feel free to keep putting questions in the chat as they come up later. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So obviously, I think a big point that Natalie and Emma and Adam have brought up here is that they're willing to work with you if you're interested in applying these tools to your community. So I know that maybe you want to look at it and think about this and make a decision of whether or not that's applicable to your community. But please definitely look at those links. We will share their slides afterwards with everyone, so you can have a chance to kind of look at how other communities have tested this out. And particularly for that Flood Resilience Scorecard, it sounds like they really need some communities that are willing to test that out. So please, please volunteer. This could be like a really great wintertime project, is to fill this out and be prepared for those spring and summer flooding. Okay, so we've been focused on Wisconsin. Now let's go back to Minnesota, because we're a great state too. We are excited. We're going to be trying out something that's new for the CHAOSS group. We're going to try doing a virtual field trip, and we did this through a video. We're going to Grand Marais, Minnesota, and we're going to see 2 projects that have implemented nature-based shoreline solutions. One is a vegetative buffer, and another is focused on using boulders as well as a berm, artificial berm, and natural grasses to protect their shoreline. Since we're not able to go there in person, hopefully this video will help give you an idea of what the sites look like. You get to hear a little bit about what the different stakeholders felt about the project and how it has performed. And this is obviously our first time trying this out, and I'm not an expert videographer. We had somebody else put it together, but I took the film, so all blame on that goes to me. But please keep a critical eye out, because we're going to ask you some questions afterwards to help improve this, because we'd like that to be a resource that we can share afterwards, that if someone is interested in doing a project like this, you can share this with them and get a little bit of a kind of on-the-site view of what these projects look like. So I'm going to try to share. this video. All right, hold on 1 second.
It takes a few minutes to get to Grand Marais anyway, so.
Yes.
Thanks
And
for your
most importantly here, I just want to point out that these locations are right around the corner from a very popular donut shop. So when you are next in Grand Marais and you're getting your donuts, you can actually just walk over and see these sites.
Living on Lake Superior is a beautiful experience, but lakeside living comes with challenges. With high water levels and frequent coastal storms, coastal property owners are dealing with more direct impacts from the lake itself. Here in Minnesota's North Shore, we're looking at how some residents are using nature-based means to adapt to changing conditions and protect their shoreline property.
But we're really close to the lake, right? And so we get all of the lake's different, temperaments, from calm days to really stormy days. We've been seeing more and more like storms that start to eat away at the shoreline, especially in the fall and early winter.
Grand Marais, Minnesota sits on the western Lake Superior coast, where Artist Point divides the coastline into Grand Marais Harbor and East Bay. Two East Bay sites demonstrate how unique nature-based approaches that include native plant and shoreline buffers can protect against waves and erosion damage. East Bay Suites and the Best Western Superior Inn offer two examples of approaches that other property owners can consider.
And so we were looking at the portion of the shoreline that was still soft in our mind. It was that area that we were looking for solutions on how to strengthen that area and really preserve whatever lakeshore we could. One of the considerations was, maintaining lake view and trying to be as natural and native to the area as we could be.
Both site owners work directly with contractors experienced with using native plants for shoreline restoration. East Bay Suites also built a really strong working relationship with the Cook County Soil and Water Conservation District.
We just put a lot of trust in the people that we were working with. We had such a close partnership with Cook County on it.
Nature-based shorelines, also called living or hybrid shorelines, are newer in the Great Lakes, but have been widely used in marine coastal areas. The Best Western Superior Inn site uses large rocks as a physical barrier between the lake and the property, with a constructed berm and native grasses behind. East Bay Suite site uses a more diverse group of shrubs, trees, and flowering plants to form a shoreline buffer.
We knew that our project was a little different as a community, including myself, that we were a little skeptical about how something that might work on a smaller body of water, how that could work on Lake Superior. So we've been surprised at the resiliency of it.
Planning a nature-based shoreline protection project continues after project design and installation. To be successful, these projects require long-term maintenance over many years while plants establish and grow. Maintenance may include watering, weeding, and extensive debris removal.
Somebody going into it just needs to be aware, especially if they're in a climate as extreme as Lake Superior can be, that there can be, subsequent years of just maintenance and still, tending to it.
Last year when we had our big storm, the beach gravel piled all the way in, so you couldn't even see the rocks anymore. It was level to the top of the rocks after the storm was over. The beach gravel did end up going over top of the berm, and that we had to remove in the spring.
With these, early winter storms, they end up throwing a lot of rock and gravel onto the plantings. We had some larger natural boulders moved into the space as a buffer.
because those boulders really help block a lot of that sediment. But in the early spring, after all the snow and ice melt, there's always a lot of sand and small rock that gets pushed up over from the winter storms. That takes some clearing out. We typically do that over the course of a week or two, a couple hours a day, with either leaf blowers and just blow the debris back towards the lakeside, or brooms and sweeping it up. It's just a small process of carefully removing it without damaging the plants.
The unexpected maintenance of having to remove all of this beach gravel after each storm required much more labor hours than expected, and probably is what would be expected for most Lake Superior shorelines if they are so close to a beachy area rather than like a bedrock area.
If you're interested in pursuing any method of shoreline stabilization, nature-based or otherwise, it's important to reach out to experts and get advice specific to your property.
I would say the resources like any of the soil and water resources in the county would be somebody that they for sure would want to reach out to for recommendations. I think that'd probably be the biggest thing, is just getting connected with people that really understand projects of that scope.
As much as the Conservation District sells these projects, there's also really good native landscaping contractors that are out here advocating for natural shoreline buffers as well. And so when you first start planning for a project, it can feel overwhelming, but I would encourage anybody to start small. You might realize how easy it is and you can expand on it later. Looking at the Natural Resources Conservation Service guidelines for critical area planting, that gives some more specific guidelines for planting projects and native shoreline restorations. For species selection, using the DNR's native plant communities, they specifically have ones for Lake Superior that can give you an idea for species selections and what you might actually find native and growing in this type of area.
The big thing is making sure it's going to be put in so it's stable. I mean, when you got Lake Superior, it's not a lake, it's an ocean. And so you have to factor that in, so if you do something, you want to keep it at the edge of your property, right where it becomes an erosion problem, or, where the waves aren't really hitting it so hard, they're just kind of rolling into that area. I guess that would be my advice.
These projects exemplify that natural-based shoreline protection methods can work to make coastal Minnesota more resilient to high water levels and wave impacts.
To our surprise, it's been very resilient. When you go up there in April after the snow melts, or sometimes May after the snow melts, you would think it's there's no way this is going to come back. But every year it comes through. We're looking forward to just seeing it grow and evolve. And our hope is that it's a permanent piece of the lakeshore now. It's really our hope that this can be self-sustaining and that we won't have to take those more hard solutions. At this point, it's doing a great job, and it looks great.
Another big lesson learned is that I'm just continually reminded of the force of nature, both in the power of Lake Superior and its abilities to just change that shoreline environment, but also the ability of native plants to bounce back. They're truly resilient.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you were able to listen to that. We would like to get some feedback from you. So this is our first time ever doing a virtual tour like this. First question we have is, what did you like in this video? Do you like the site and project description? Do you like the visuals, those different perspectives and the narration? Did you like the flow? Is there anything else that you thought was good? You can put that into the chat box. Just take a few seconds. I see a question from Greg. Yes, we will. We're going to take all of the feedback we have today. We're going to edit this a little bit more and add some more detail into the video and then post it on the DNR website so that this would be a resource that you could look at. Do you want to go ahead? Let's see. So it seems like the visual was very popular. Having those different perspectives and the site and project description. Looks like maybe we could work on the flow a little bit and the narration a little bit. Okay, sounds good. Our next question is what's missing? We do have a little handout that we're going to share with you after this meeting that gives a little bit more about the cost and some of those design details. Do you want to see that in the video? Those are some questions we have. So it looks like cost information is big, design details. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, I think we're good with this question. So it looks like cost information was the biggest thing missing. Okay, we will add that in. And you know, how would you improve this video? So if you have any suggestions, please add that directly into the chat box or reach out to me after the meeting and we can improve this. We hope that this will be a resource, not just for the CHAOS group, but for those of you who are working with property owners and you'd like to share an example of something that's local. So we would appreciate anything you have to suggest. Yes, pictures are worth 1,000 words. Okay, so that's really good. All right, now we are very fortunate. One of the perspectives, one of those stakeholders that was in the video is Michaela Clingaman. She is from the Cook County Soil and Water Conservation District. She's going to join us today and give a little bit more detail about the East Bay Suites project. So that was the very diverse planting-based vegetation buffer project. And she's going to share some more information about that project, and then we'll have time for some questions with her. So Michaela, I don't know if you want to turn on your video or start sharing your screen.
Hey everyone, I am starting up my presentation. How's the volume? Can everyone hear me okay? All right, I am gonna get going here. So again, my name is Michaela Clingaman. I am a conservation technician for Cook County Soil and Water Conservation District. So in addition to the video put together to showcase the site, I wanted to share some photos with you to highlight what took place at East Bay Suites on planting day, as well as share some photos that show the evolution of the planting over the years and how it's really bounced back from some intense Lake Superior storms. So to get into things, with any planting, site preparation must be done, especially when you're dealing with turf grass or weedy areas that would otherwise just outcomplete a native planting. So for East Bay Suites, site preparation was done using herbicide for a few reasons. First, it was the contractor's preference who was installing the planting, but in addition to this, other methods such as smothering using black plastic or solarization would have really required a longer time for success, as well as the rocky soil conditions paired with a really windy site just wouldn't have made smothering a technique that would be feasible. So the herbicide was applied in late June, and this photo is the site just 14 days after the application, but we continue to wait to plant another 42 days just because you really want to wait at least 4 to 6 weeks before you plant to make sure that the area has had enough time to kind of mellow out from the herbicide and that it won't impact the new plantings. So once site preparation was complete, we began the planting. So for this site, a combination of seed and plugs was used. So the first step was preparing a smooth seed bed. The contractor chose to rototill up the site, and really you don't need to use a rototill all the time, but since seed was used, you need to have that good seed to soil contact. But if you were just using plugs, you could actually plant directly into that prepared or killed off turf grass. So since it was using a seed mix, it needed to be tilled up to make sure that the seed would actually grow and make contact with the soil. The next step after the seed was sown was to start staging the plants, as well as install an erosion control blanket. For this site, just a basic weed-free natural fiber straw mulch blanket was used. And once the blanket was installed, the fun really began. All of the plugs started going in the ground. You'll see here in this photo, one of the Boreal Native staff is using a large rod that's called a rock bar, and that's what they were using to create the holes for the plugs, because as expected, the site was super rocky with beach cobble and gravel, so a traditional trowel that you may use to plant plugs just wasn't cutting it for making a sufficient hole. So we kept planting and planting until all of the plugs were installed, and just over 2,000 plugs were used at this site. And it was a full day of planting with a crew of 5 people. The next step in the process was installing a 4-foot fence around the entire planting. The fence was decided to be used for a couple of reasons. The primary reason was to prevent geese from eating the planting, as well as limiting visitors from trampling the planting area. I like showing off the photo on the right because you can see this group of geese swimming in Lake Superior that were kind of watching us all day, waiting for us to leave so they could come up and eat the grass at East Bay Suites. So you'll also notice there's some flagging and string that's kind of zigzagging across the top of the fencing, and that was installed because geese have wings, they can fly, and so apparently if you kind of string up a barrier up top, they're not going to fly in there. I was definitely skeptical of this at first, but it turned out to be effective, and it did work. There was no geese that were ever in the planting area, and really the last step on planting day was setting up a watering system. This site is in a really sunny area as well on very well-drained soils, so watering daily when the planting was first getting established was super important. So really here is a side-by-side picture of what we started with before site preparation and what we ended up with at the end of our planting day. So next, I kind of wanted to get into a little bit of what happened in the weeks and months and years following after the planting was installed, because this was done in 2017. And so you'll see here our finished planting, and then on the right, just 14 days after the planting, you'll see that there's a cover crop that was sowed with the native seed. So that started coming in about a month after the planting. That cover crop is continuing to fill in the site. And then just 3 months after the planting, that cover crop is at peak growth. But you'll notice some of the cover crop is looking a little bit tipped over, and there was some waves in the background you can also see. And just 3 months after the planting had been installed was when our first storm came, and that brought a lot of gravel into the planting, and there was waves that were washing up over the planting, throwing the gravel well past the fence, and it ultimately left the area pretty hard hit and smothered. That's the photo of a back of the fence that had about 4 inches of gravel packed into it, and then an area that was probably hit the worst in between these boulders that was just really smothering. But we hoped for the best, and we came up with a plan to remove the gravel the next spring, and we just hoped that the plants were dormant by late October and that they really weren't going to be impacted. Spring came through and brought an even more intense storm that tossed up more gravel and hit the area hard again. It even displaced some of the blanketing, and you can see there that some of the plugs were kind of got their soil base washed away or in conjunction with a little bit of frost heaving. So just to give you an idea of how much it was smothered, that's about probably 8 inches of beach gravel there. And then to give you an idea of what we started with versus what we were left with in April, not even a year after it was planting, it was a little disappointing, but nevertheless, we got out there with shovels and leaf blowers and kind of delicately removed all of the gravel that we could and hoped for the best. And come July, 1 year after installation, we were pretty happy to see that it didn't look all that bad compared to April. We still had a lot of native plants that came back in. They were resilient, and there was a fair amount of diversity in there. And overall, we were happy with how it bounced back. But Those November storms certainly were not kind to us again. And another storm came and hit the planting hard. Again, can't say that we weren't feeling disappointed and a little bit bummed, but at this point we were invested and we knew that all we had to do was get out there in the spring and remove as much of the beach gravel as we could. So pretty smothered again. That same area you'll notice is the part by the boulders that are really getting a lot of that gravel washed up. But come the spring, we removed all the gravel again, best that we could. And by August of 2019, so 2 years after it was planted initially, the planting was looking good and we were pretty happy. And I like to show these photos as a comparison of just how different the planting looks between the seasons, as these photos were only taken like 27 days apart. And so you can tell how different it looks just based on the season and what's blooming. And overall, that area that looked really demolished and smothered looks pretty good. So 2020, what happened? Well, you could probably guess it. We had another spring storm, probably a little bit of a fall storm too, that tossed up some gravel onto the planting. But in 2019, we really devised a plan to start mitigating some of these impacts from lake storms that we really can only expect to continue as lake levels rise and storms become more intense. So a few more of those decorative boulders were added to block some of the waves and gravels. It wasn't necessarily put in as hard armor, but more just to fill in the gaps and buffer against the waves. We also planted 75 shrubs directly along the edge. These were mainly 9-bark, but some dogwood. And that was done in an effort to buffer the primary planting from waves. Once these plants grow up, they'll kind of take the brunt of that force. And we were already seeing where this was effective on other areas of the planting that did have a better shrub base from the beginning. And so we were really just mimicking the natural shoreline and trying to build more resilience into this planting. So at the end of September of this year, this is what we were looking at with the planting, and overall, I think it looks pretty good. I'm incredibly happy with it for 3 years into the project, having this much growth, a lot of diversity, and overall comparing from what we started with before site preparation in 2016 to this kind of unhealthy lawn area to what we have now in 2020, a good buffer that's not only benefiting water quality, but also providing some wildlife benefits, benefiting pollinators. I really couldn't be happier, even though it's gone through a lot. And I think this project just really speaks to how resilient these shoreline plantings can be if you have the right site. So that's what I wanted to share. I think we have some time open up the floor for questions. So I will go ahead and turn this back over to Melanie.
Okay, so I'm looking for questions. Let's see, I have heard a question about the boulders that were added in that kind of came up in the in the video, but also you showed some of them in your picture. They were not part of the original site design, correct?
Correct. Those were not part of the original site design. They had maybe 4 boulders there that were just more of a decorative piece. And since that area had just repeatedly been smothered by beach gravel, they thought, well, maybe we can just fill in those gaps between the boulders with a few more and hope for the best. And it really hasn't stood the test of time too much. I think next spring we'll see how effective they were, but ultimately it's just kind of one more barrier between the planting and the waves and the beach gravel.
Okay. Now, in the video, you mentioned a couple of resources. I just want to point out, we made a little handout that kind of gives some before and after photos of these sites, and that actually has those resources listed. So you've got the links directly to those. But yes, do we have questions from anyone? I see some just kind of like the wave environment in at these sites. So can you mention it? Can you explain anything more about like what you've seen? You've obviously seen those storm impacts. In the video, that one little clip of the waves hitting the shoreline, that was at the East Bay Suites site. Should point that out. And I also heard from the other property owner, that Best Western Superior, and they were actually experiencing the waves hitting the building. They were but can you give any feedback about what you've seen in terms of those storm impacts of those properties?
Yeah, definitely. So as a conservation district, we get a lot of calls for site visits for landowners that are experiencing erosion problems. And in the more recent years, we've had lots of Lake Superior erosion calls following storm events. So the East Bay of Grand Marais has certainly been hit harder than some areas. I think primarily that has to do with just the underlying geology of that shoreline and not having a lot of slope between the lake and where the buildings are situated. The buildings are also incredibly close in that area and all of downtown Grand Marais. So this was an area that we knew about well before I started with the district. Maybe in 2015, we had the city of Grand Marais calling us out to this site because the waves had gotten so intense that they had started undercutting an area of road on Wisconsin Street there too. And so the other areas along East Bay have more of a hard armored approach, but even other businesses have had to kind of mitigate from storm damages that have happened in the recent years and either increased that hard armor or had to deal with just the amount of gravel being washed up. So it's been hit hard. There's been lots of lake storms. And another thing I wanted to ask, the question in the chat, people had asked how much was this planting project for East Bay Suites. The cost for the contractor to install the planting, do the site preparation was a little around $9,000. The landowners did contribute 25% of the cost to for this project, as it was a grant program through the Board of Soil and Water Resources that our district was distributing. And so it was a little more than $9,000 for this planting, whereas if you're comparing a hard armored practice for that length of shoreline, I'm not an engineer, but I know it would be in the upwards of multiple thousands of dollars.
Yes, and in terms of the area of the planting, I think when I try to trace it out, it was about 125 feet of shoreline. Is that roughly right?
That is a good question. I don't have the linear feet of shoreline off the top of my head, but the planting area was about 2,500 square feet.
That helps. So do you have any tips or advice for anyone who's looking at, is this something I can do on my shoreline?
I would say the biggest advice I could share with you is contact your local soil and water conservation district. We're here to help with coming up with a plan for your property, and I think they would be able to put you in the right direction of what may be feasible at your property. That said, there are certainly areas where maybe a natural shoreline-based approach might not be feasible, and it's really just dependent on your site conditions. You can go 200 feet down the shoreline and you're in a completely different environment. So reach out to your conservation districts. They will help you as much as they can or point you in the right direction to someone who can get you the help that you need.
Great. We do have another question that popped in. Do you expect this project to become more self-sustaining when the shrubs are full size, or do you expect that they would have to keep going in every year, removing that beach gravel?
Right. I am really hoping that it becomes more self-sustainable. I think, as we highlighted in the video, the unexpected maintenance of having to come back year after year to remove the gravel, it was more done because the planting was so young and that these small little plugs didn't even have a year of growth on them, and they would have just been completely smothered and the project would have been a wash. Looking back, what I might have done was try to plant that kind of buffer of shrubs right in front of where the planting was going to go a couple years prior to doing the planting, just so that way we reduced that potential for the planting to get as smothered as much as it did. So hopefully as the shrubs grow up, they will reduce the impacts of lake storms. And I hope that we won't have to be out there annually removing gravel. That's not an ideal situation.
All right, well, that's very, very good point that you've made there. And again, we are going to go back, we're going to edit that video. We appreciate all the feedback everyone's provided. If there's more things like you'd like to provide, definitely reach out to me, or you want to know more about those projects. Obviously, Michaela is also available for consultation. So we're running a few minutes early, so I just want to take a moment to see if there are any additional questions or comments from the group. We have all of our speakers still here. While we wait a moment for that, I did want to make a couple of points before we close out. We are going to have our next quarterly meeting in January, so we won't see each other before the holidays. We hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. For that meeting, we're talking about including a focus on the new flood maps that are being produced for the Great Lakes Coastal Flood Study. If that's an interest for you, let us know. If you have something that you would like to share, a project or something that you're working on, or even if it's a question for the group, if it's something that you're really interested in learning more about and you'd like to just pose that to this group, this is a great audience, please reach out to me and we can work on including that into our next meeting. But we do have some exciting news. We are going to try doing a second virtual field trip because it's going to be January. We're going to be stuck inside. It's going to be cold. For those of us that are not from Minnesota, it's going to be very cold. And we're going to go over to Wisconsin Point. And we've been working on taking footage there of the dune restoration as that living shoreline on Aloise Bay. So expect to see some work from that. And I did see another question that came in about, are there any permitting challenges for that project? Michaela, do you want to share your answer with the group?
Sure. So all of the work at East Bay Suites took place above the ordinary high water line. So there wasn't a DNR public waters permit that was needed. There also wasn't any grading or filling done on the site. So local permits such as the Cook County grade and fill permit wasn't necessary. We just had a licensed herbicide applicator come out, the contractor, Boreal Natives, to spray the site. They used a herbicide that was safe for use on or near water, rodeo. It's essentially a glyphosate type of herbicide. So there weren't any permits needed.
So it sounds like that permitting question will depend on specifically where you're trying to do that planting and if you're going to be doing anything in that ordinary high water line or if you're doing any type of fill.
Right. If we were doing any
so that's definitely good to know. Earth moving, yeah.
Yep. Any earth moving activities that would have triggered some county permits, but we didn't do those. So no challenges with permits for this project.
That's great to hear. So barring any other questions, want to thank all of our speakers for coming today and sharing this very interesting work that they're doing to try to make our communities more resilient. Again, I just want to emphasize for those of you who have a coastal community would benefit from using either the Coastal Resiliency Self-Assessment Tool or the new Flood Resilience Scorecard to get in touch with our speakers and talk to them about how you can implement that in your community and get some feedback. Particularly that Flood Resilience Scorecard is looking for some communities to test it out. And a special thank you to Madison Rodman for hosting us today and everyone for joining us. So thank you so much. And go outside and enjoy the nice weather while we still have it.